So hi again, Sue North. It's a pleasure to connect with you again. We are connecting with Joel Cohen from Jerusalem, Israel, and today he's going to be talking about justice after the Holocaust. This is my first time seeing the session, so I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that you are again inspired by his stories and receive a lot of information. He certainly is an expert on all of these topics, and we really appreciate him getting up and speaking with us all the way from Israel. So over to you, Joel.
Okay, thank you very, very much. A pleasure to be with you again. And our topic today is justice after the Holocaust. Is there such a thing? After the greatest crime ever committed in the history of humanity, is there such a thing as justice? What was done after the Holocaust in order to pursue justice? And additionally, is there justice to be done today? And again, we are years and years after the liberation, 75 years after the camps. Is there still such a thing as justice after the Holocaust today? Just a reminder, I am talking to you from Israel, clear across the Atlantic Ocean from you folks. We are 7 hours ahead of Eastern time here. Again, this is the country of Israel. It's a small country. We're 8.6 million people in the country. If Israel were in Canada, this is what it would look like. I think Canada is 46 times larger than Israel in terms of the area of the country. In the United States, this is what it would look like. So it's a small, tight-knit sort of country. As I said before, 8.6 million people. This is my street, minus the arrow that is put there by the Google Maps people. A typical residential street in Jerusalem, low-rise apartment houses, maybe 3-4 stories high. There are other parts of the city we do have high rises, but this is most of the residential areas of the city look like this. The city itself is approximately 750,000 people. On April 28th, excuse me, April 21st, we will be commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day here in Israel, in memory of the 6 million Jews. This particular Holocaust Remembrance Day is perhaps a little bit more noteworthy because I said before, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary since the liberation of the concentration camps. Earlier this year, a large group of world leaders came here to Yad Vashem, our memorial museum here in Jerusalem, to commemorate this event and to come as one and to say that we denounce anti-Semitism. Here is the group of Holocaust survivors in Auschwitz today. It's a museum going back 75 years later in order to commemorate this particular very auspicious anniversary. But now to our subject. What happens after the Holocaust was over? Can there be justice? And how was justice administered? So the first thing you may be aware of is that with the Nuremberg trials, look at the date, November 20th, 1945. The war ended in June of 1945, and immediately afterwards, some of the most notorious Nazi leaders are brought to trial in Nuremberg. Hitler committed suicide earlier on. However, at this trial are some of the major government ministers. And question is, what can be done after this most heinous crime? Do you just go ahead and take these people and have a show trial and hang them, kill them? Or is there such a thing as justice after the Holocaust?
There's no sound, Joel.
Okay, here, that's my fault. Okay.
Vengeance, no.
Can I go back to the beginning, or should I just play that again?
Just go back to the beginning. That would be great,
Okay.
please.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to press the button with the sound. And here we go. Okay. Sorry. You ready? I lost your sound now.
Oh,
Hello?
just at the video, there was no sound.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the beginning, right? Should I go back to the beginning of the video or the beginning of the program?
Of the video.
Oh, the video.
video.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I'll get to that. Okay.
After the liberation, this Russian, he happened to be a colonel in the army. You know what he told me? He said, we will give you guns, and you can go around any German you see. You can shoot. And we're thinking to ourselves, what in the heck is he talking about? I didn't like what they were doing, so I go do that. Justice, yes. Vengeance, no.
That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
Let's take a look at those words of Justice Jackson. Once again, very, very important words. The four great nations, and that's the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France, flushed with victory, they just won the war, and stung with injury at the cost of millions of lives, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law. That very easily, American soldiers, Allied soldiers could have just gone around and taken people who they knew were Nazis and just shoot them, get rid of them, very, very, in the fields, and just let's move on. Let's move on with our business. But yet, a policy was enacted, a decision was made, and what did they do? That they voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Power says kill them. Reason says wait a second. There still needs to be justice. We have to give them a chance to defend themselves. There has to be a real trial. And indeed, Nuremberg was a real trial. It was different in that somehow, Molly, I'm seeing you and not, that shouldn't be. Okay, thank you. Okay. It's different in that there were no witnesses in Nuremberg. At Nuremberg, it was just government memos, all sorts of paperwork that the Germans were extremely meticulous in keeping records that was brought to them in Nuremberg in order to prove their involvement in this ever committed.
The International Military Tribunal, which we more generally know of as the Nuremberg Trial, began in November 1945, so only months after the end of the war in Europe, and it lasted for 1 year until the verdicts were issued.
The defendants are the people who are surviving principal Nazi leaders. So you have the Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, Hitler's number 2, Rudolf Hess, who had been Hitler's number 3, you have Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister, you have the military leaders of the Army and of the Navy.
After you came to power, you were regarded as necessary.
The indictment had 4 counts. conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, traditional war crimes, and count 4 was brand new crimes against humanity, crimes against civilians that were divorced entirely from military operations, as well as crimes we would later call genocide.
They don't have the word Holocaust, but in a sense, over the course of the year of the international trial at Nuremberg, they're discovering the enormity of it.
Much of what we know about the history of the Holocaust first emerged at the International Military Tribunal. For example, the number of 6 million Jewish victims appeared at that trial. Testimony about the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto emerged at Nuremberg. Additionally, the tribunal was heavily covered by the press in a way that public knowledge of atrocities had never before been reported.
So really, the Nuremberg trials created a sense of justice. At the Nuremberg trials, 11 Nazis were sentenced to hang. Actually, 10 hanged. One of them was able to commit suicide before the sentence was administered. Interestingly enough, a number of the people on trial were actually acquitted. Remember, these are not people who put on the switch in the gas chambers. These were not people who had guns and went around shooting Jews. These were people that planned the operation. So some of the people actually on trial were acquitted, and the court said that they did not really have prior knowledge as to what was happening. So Nuremberg was a very, very important step in the beginning of justice after the Holocaust. But as I said, the Nuremberg trial, 10 Nazis were hanged. In order to understand the enormity of what happened, it didn't take 10 Nazis. It wasn't Hitler running around with a gun shooting a lot of people. It took thousands and thousands and thousands of people in order to go ahead and to murder 6 million Jews. What happened to all those other people besides those that were eventually tried at the various Nuremberg trials? Many of them were able to just go back to life. Many of them returned to towns in Germany and resumed life. Many of them ran away to other countries. And they basically lived pretty peaceful lives, except for this man. His name was Simon Wiesenthal, and he is known as the principal Nazi hunter. Simon Wiesenthal was a survivor of the Holocaust. He could not rest after the Holocaust. He knew that many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust had just gone back to civilian lives and looking just to continue life as if nothing had happened. And he was extremely, extremely, I can't think of the word right now, but he was emotionally involved, that he needed to go ahead and he needed to bring them to justice. During his career, Simon Wiesenthal was able to catch up with some 1,100 Nazis and to bring them to trial in various countries. So at once he was a beloved man for that which he was doing. However, many Nazis or many Germans and Austrians who were accused by him considered him to be a bitter enemy. Let's learn a little bit more about Simon Wiesenthal.
I am not a Jewish James Bond, and I am not a Don Quixote, and I am not between. I am only a survivor who pays with a dedicated work for the privilege to remain alive.
When millions were murdered, why was I allowed to live? For more than half a century, Simon Wiesenthal has asked himself this question again and again.
He came out of the Holocaust with nobody, nothing, 99 pounds, he was barely alive. And with that, he wouldn't give up.
Wiesenthal really fought to bring Nazi criminals to justice and to leave a historic record of what they've done.
He was the only one who systematically tried to find Eichmann.
Your organization had tracked down some 1,100 Nazis.
The mere thought that Wiesenthal would be on the case meant that lots of malefactors could not sleep at night.
Hat sich umgebracht.
He was interrogated and he tells right away, I arrest Anne. The case was finished.
Wiesenthal became extremely unpopular in Austria.
He was hated. He was hated.
My father took precautions and I was taken to school with police guard, which was dreadful.
He always used to say, if you want to find a cure for malaria, you have to live where the mosquitoes live.
There was not only Jews, there was Frenchmen, there was Dutch people, there was Russians, there was Gypsies. They are in a common mass grave. Why don't mention them?
Andere Leute nach dem Krieg haben sich nach einer Zeit irgendwie ihr Leben normalisieren können. Und bei uns hat man das Gefühl, dass es geht noch immer weiter.
For Simon Wiesenthal, the war never ended, and he was the primary Nazi hunter, again bringing approximately 1,100 Nazis to justice. One of the most infamous Nazis to escape after the Holocaust was this man, Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi in charge of logistics, of how to bring as many Jews as possible to the concentration camps. And he figured out the railroad systems and everything else to be able to transport millions of Jews to their deaths in concentration camps. After the war, Adolf Eichmann just totally disappeared. Besides Simon Wiesenthal, one of the other interested parties in finding Eichmann was the Israeli government. Israel, as the only Jewish state in the world, felt that it was also compelled to try to go ahead and to bring Nazis to justice. Adolf Eichmann had escaped to Argentina. For a variety of reasons, Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay had leanings that made them fertile grounds for Nazis to escape to after World War II. The Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, was in Argentina, and they were able to locate Adolf Eichmann in the house on Garibaldi Street. He was living under the radar. He had assumed a different name, but the Mossad was able to identify him, and they were able to bring him back here to Jerusalem, Israel, to stand trial. His trial was very different than Nuremberg, because in his trial, witnesses were called. People told their stories. And Eichmann was in the defendant's cage, so to speak, listening to all the atrocities that he had been a party to as a major Nazi member.
Reflecting on the Holocaust, we're talking about a crime that's state-sponsored. And instrumental in the bureaucracy of the Holocaust was an SS officer named Adolf Eichmann, who really was the coordinating the arrest, the assembly of Jews in the occupied countries, and their transportation to the places where they would be killed.
He was probably responsible for the murder of at least 1.3 million people.
After the war, he escaped Europe and went to South America, lived under the radar under a different name, but lived a normal life for over a decade until he was found by Israeli agents who brought him back to the state of Israel to stand trial.
Unlike the Nuremberg trial, the Eichmann trial focused exclusively on that series of events that we now call the Holocaust. It gave, on an international stage, the opportunity for Holocaust survivors to tell their story.
People standing up, often in great pain, often for the first time, and telling what happened to them, how they were tortured, how their families were murdered, how their communities were destroyed. Yet again, like Nuremberg, he is not just killed. He is given a lawyer. He is given a public trial with immense press attention, with witnesses, with the chance to mount a defense.
In May of 1962, he was pronounced guilty on appeal and executed. And that did a very important thing. It established the principle that there's no statute of limitations for these crimes.
Statute of limitations. Many crimes in many places, years after the crime is committed, you can no longer be tried for the crime. But Eichmann, even though the trial took place well after the crimes were committed, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was hanged. He's the only person in the history of the state of Israel ever to be hanged for his crimes, and his ashes were spread at sea. There are other Nazis who somehow were able to escape justice. Perhaps the most prominent of them is this, I hesitate to call him a person, Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele was known as Dr. Death, or the Doctor of Auschwitz. When Jews would arrive at Auschwitz, he'd be sitting there, and he'd be the one to decide who would be immediately sent to the gas chamber and who would be sent to the barracks in order to become a slave laborer. Joseph Mengele was also infamously involved with experiments on live people. He had a special infatuation with twins. Joseph Mengele was never found. He was reported to have escaped to either Brazil or Paraguay, and then he eventually died of natural causes. But to his victims, justice was never administered to Joseph Mengele.
At 91 years old, Alina Dubrovska is still consumed by the horror of what happened to her here. It is why she has brought her granddaughter, Eva, for the first time. It is why she wanted to talk to us about her memories. And it is why, for 50 years, she could never set foot in this place.
Once I tried to come here with my children, and I couldn't move. I was paralyzed.
In these buildings, Alina was a victim of the cruel experiments carried out by this man, Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. For the first time, Alina is shown some of the tools used by Mengele for his cruel experiments, sterilizations, crude transplants, and here, even the typhus she was injected with as a guinea pig to test medicines.
I had hallucination. I got a very high fever, as never in my life. Earlier and afterwards, I had no such a high fever.
And you think you thought you were going to die?
Yes.
At nearby Block 10, where many of the experiments took place, she could not bring herself to cross the threshold.
I am very glad that we are here, not going further.
And who can blame her? This remains an eerie, sickening place of dark corridors and rooms with dreadful secrets. In one, a dissection table. What grotesque atrocities were carried out by doctors here in the name of medical research?
I don't think they are normal men. I can't find a proper English word for this. They're bestia, so beast.
However, these beasts never had to meet justice. They were able to live out their lives, hopefully not in peace, but they were able to live out their lives until their natural death. What about Nazis in Canada? Was there such a thing? Very much yes. After World War II, it's hard for us to understand, and to be frank with you, I do not understand. Nazis were led into all sorts of countries, into Canada, into the United States, for a variety of reasons. Most often than not, the countries were really focused on rebuilding. After World War II, people did not want to focus on bringing justice to the Nazis, but rather they wanted to focus on rebuilding their economies, rebuilding their lives, rebuilding their communities, etc., etc. There was also the start of the Cold War, the war of democracies against Russia and their allies, which really very, very much became front and center of foreign policy. And as a result, many, many former Nazis, people that worked in the concentration camps, were part of what happened, were able to simply lie to immigration officers and be able to start new lives in a variety of countries, including Canada. In 1980, again, liberation was in 1945. In 1980, Simon Wiesenthal put pressure on Canada to start to clean up, to start to try to identify those people who were involved in this greatest crime on earth, and then subsequently given citizenship in Canada.
It was in the spring of this year that the government began to tell Canadians about their new plans for dealing with war criminals living here. Among those Canadians, some who remembered the darkest hours of their people's lives, Jews who survived the Holocaust, the Nazi plan to obliterate them once and for all. And it was the new Solicitor General, Robert Kaplan, a young Jewish lawyer representing a Toronto constituency, who delivered the message from the steps of the Ontario Parliament building.
In the Government of Canada, we have begun the process, which will only take a few months, of searching the issues among the ministries that are involved in this question: citizenship, immigration, external affairs, justice, my own ministry, to find a way to address the problem of war criminals in Canada.
Well, it's really quite amazing. And that speech was done in 1980. That's when we're going to start. That means from 1945 to 1980, barely anything was done. Now, this Mr. Kaplan's prediction of a couple of months did not really reach fruition, though Canada did start to make efforts in 1980 to try to identify those people who are war criminals. A bit later in the program, we'll see if any Nazis are still living in Canada today. And the answer, unfortunately, will be yes. In the United States, same problem. Many former Nazis or collaborators with the Nazis simply lied to immigration officials. People looked the other way. Not enough was done in order to identify who these people were. And this is the picture of John Demjanjuk. John Demjanjuk was a former guard in one of the SS in the concentration camps, and yet he immigrated to Cleveland. And he lived in Cleveland for many, many years until finally, after many trials, he was finally deported. He was finally deported to Germany. That was the case of John Demjanjuk. And what you see here, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of minutes, is that here's this picture as an ID card during World War II. And then when he's finally brought to a German court, it's years and years later, and he's a 95-year-old sickly man who suffered from dementia. And the question very, very much is there justice after all these years, when the people who are involved in these crimes are much, much older, many years have passed, and are they still the same people, and can they still be held responsible so many years later? Well, this really came to front a couple of years ago in Germany with the trial of Oskar Groening. Oskar Groening was known as the accountant of Auschwitz, which means as such. His job in the notorious concentration camp was when people were robbed of all their possessions when they came off the trains, he simply counted it up, how much money, how much gold, how much silver, whatever it was. He kept a careful accounting and shipped it on to Berlin, the German capital. He was well aware of what was going on. He himself never actively participated in what was going on, but was very well aware. For years, that was not enough to bring former Nazis to trial. More recently, as everyone was getting older, and people realized that all these people that were involved and were in Auschwitz, working in Auschwitz, in all the concentration camps, were basically getting off, the laws would change, and they were allowed to be brought to trial. And approximately 4 years ago, Oskar Groening was brought to trial for his participation in what happened in Auschwitz. There were different opinions whether this was a fair thing to do. Number one, he didn't pull any triggers. He didn't push anybody into gas chambers. Yes, he was part. Yes, he knew what was going on. Number two, this is some 70, 75 years later. Can a man be brought to trial for what he did as a 20, 21-year-old when he's a 90, 91-year-old man?
The train stopped. After a while, all of a sudden, the doors were opened. They started screaming that men and boys into one column. What happened to my mom and my sister, I don't know. But I've never seen them again, never said goodbye to them. They just disappeared from my life that moment. I feel that I have a responsibility as a survivor to make sure that the Holocaust should not be forgotten. I felt that I must be a witness at the trial.
What may be one of the last big Holocaust trials opened today in Germany.
Oskar Gröning is charged with more than 300,000 counts of accessory to murder. Known as the bookkeeper.
The bookkeeper. The bookkeeper. The bookkeeper of Auschwitz.
Gröning's job was to collect the victims' valuables.
Well, he says he did not kill anyone himself. He admitted in court he felt morally guilty.
We were sitting in the courtroom and this frail old man walked in.
I thought, you are the same Nazi, the same person who thought you were gods and we were vermin.
The whole Holocaust is one crime. The whole Holocaust is one crime. Everybody who has been in Auschwitz has been part of the killing.
Of the 6,000 or 7,000 guards who went through Auschwitz, I think about 100 or so were prosecuted.
Then all of a sudden the prosecution in Germany changed the rules of the game. Anyone who served in a death camp could be prosecuted based on service alone of accessory to murder. The question then was, how many of these people are alive?
Germany's making up for it with what it's got. There's slim pickings these days for Nazi war criminals. They got Gröning, they went after him.
They're not Hitler, they're not Himmler, but they were there, therefore they too have a share of the responsibility.
He was a cog in the wheel, but the wheel couldn't have turned without that cog.
I do feel sorry for Gröning. There was not 1 ounce of meanness in his body.
If you punish a man of 93 for something that he did when he was 23, are you still punishing the person who did the crime?
I cannot forgive and I can't forget. If we don't learn from the past, we repeat the same mistakes again.
If we can send a powerful message that there is no statute of limitations on genocide, it could have an impact.
I have a responsibility, having survived. This is the last of the Nazi trials.
So there's some very, very deep questions which are being asked. Is anybody that was there? Are they all responsible for what happened? Can you actually hold somebody responsible 70 years after the fact? When someone was 21 or 22, they committed a crime. Can they be brought to justice when they're 91 and 92? Gröning was eventually convicted. He was sentenced to jail time, but he died before he was able to serve any of this time. Mentioned before Canada. Are there any Nazis still in Canada? So I said to you, unfortunately, the answer is yes. And this particular man that lives in Canada, he's elderly today, Helmut Oberlander, really shows to you what happens with Nazis in Canada. 1941 to 1943, he served as an interpreter for one of the infamous death squads which operated in the Ukraine. He came to Canada in 1954 under false information. And in 1960, he became a fully naturalized citizen of Canada. It wasn't until 1995 that he was identified by Canadian authorities as having lied to his immigration papers in 1954, and they started proceedings to deport him. In 2020, now, in March 2020, at the age of 95, Helmut Oberlander still lives in Canada. There's been trial after trial, appeal after appeal. The latest appeal goes through the same argument. It says, okay, himself. He's 95 years old. He's dying. He's feeble. He's knows but as of today, involved, totally different people involved, but it's the same company. Should they be held responsible? Well, it really came to light a couple of years ago when there was a new railroad being planned for the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And one of the bidders to go ahead and to construct this railroad was the SNCF.
The proposed rail line, called the Purple Line, will run right through here to this Silver Spring stop on its path through the Maryland suburbs. But 70-year-old actions are affecting today's decisions, and it's anything but business as usual.
My maternal grandparents, my paternal great-grandparents, and I also lost my aunt, my father's sister. The suffering didn't end in the gas chambers and the crematoria of Auschwitz.
Maryland resident Ellen Lightman cherishes keepsakes of her family, lost in the Holocaust.
There was always this hole about what were they really like.
During World War II, France was overrun by German troops, and French trains and rail employees were placed under Nazi control. Leidman's family members were among 76,000 people, mostly Jews, transported by SNCF rail to Nazi death camps.
They were paid per head per kilometer to transport people, human beings. They were complicit and they need to be held accountable.
SNCF did not do it. The Nazis did it.
Alain Leray is president of SNCF America and says the company also paid a heavy toll.
800 were executed because they had disobeyed orders. Another 1,200 were deported and murdered in deportation. So when I hear that we somehow were complicit, I say, were we really complicit with more than 2,100 of our own employees being murdered by the Nazis?
It's quite the question. Quite the question. To what degree should these companies still be held responsible for what happened so many years ago? In the case of SNCF, they eventually agreed to pay what's called reparations, basically monies to Holocaust survivors for what they did during the Holocaust. But the question still very much remains, should these companies, and there are more than a few that are still operating today, that were active in the German war machine and in the German attempt to commit genocide against the Jewish people. Another question which is very much involved, and that is, should Poland be held responsible? While Germany was the country, the Nazis, and they were the armies that perpetrated the crime, most of the large concentration camps were located in Poland. Treblinka, Sobibor, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, etc., etc. Now, Poland, were they part of it or were they not part of it? Polish government today says, well, it wasn't us. They made the concentration camps on our soil. Many argue that only happened because there were many Poles who collaborated with the Germans, who helped the Germans, who identified where the Jews lived, who took over Jewish property after the Jews were arrested and thrown into the concentration camps. They helped build these concentration camps. They helped run the concentration camps. Now, there's still an ongoing, it's 80 years later, should Poland be held responsible for the Holocaust, or victims of question regarding justice after the Holocaust regards property that was looted during the Holocaust. Most to the question is looted art. There were many very famous paintings that had belonged to Jewish art dealers that either they were forced to sell them by the Nazis at way below their market value, or they were just stolen by the Nazis. For some reason, the Nazis collected literally thousands and thousands of famous paintings. Years later, and recently as well, these paintings have shown up in all sorts of places, including museums who thought that they acquired them in a lawful manner. And now, descendants of Holocaust survivors or Holocaust victims are coming forward and saying they belong to us. This was my grandfather's. My grandfather, great grandfather painting. He was forced to sell it by the Nazis.
An emotional moment for Sylvie Solitzer as she helped unveil her grandfather's Renoir. The painting, Two Women in a Garden, was looted from her family's vault in France by Nazis during World War II.
I'm very thankful to be able to show my beloved family, wherever they are, that after all what they've been through, there is a justice.
Her grandfather, Alfred Weinberger, was a prominent Jewish art collector in Paris. After the war, he registered his missing property with both French and German authorities, but it wasn't until an online database created in 2010 that Solitzer learned of her grandfather's missing art.
When Madame Solitzer learned in 2013 that Deux Femmes was being put up for auction at Christie's, she made a claim for the work. After an investigation by my office and the FBI, the purported owner of the work voluntarily agreed to relinquish its claim to the Deux Femmes, and as a result, we are able to return the painting to Madame Solitzer today.
It's believed that around 100,000 works of art and millions of books were stolen from French Jews by the Nazis during World War II.
So there are many questions when it comes to justice after the Holocaust. Not just what happened right after the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, not just what happened to certain major Nazis who were able to escape and able to escape justice. What countries did in order to try to locate former Nazis that were living freely in their countries. And now the question, even after all these years, is, are there any Nazis that are still alive who should be held responsible, or are they too old really to be held responsible for what they did? Should we hold responsible companies that were active in one way or another in perpetrating the greatest crime ever committed on the planet? Should we be going after looted property that may exist today in museums who feel that they paid for the property? They had no idea that these paintings were stolen by the Nazis, but the descendants of the survivors are able to come and to say, let us have something. Let us have something from our grandparents. Let us have something from our great-grandparents. So these are many, many questions regarding justice after the Holocaust. But the most important justice after the Holocaust is to remember. The greatest injustice would be if we forget what happened in the years 1939 and 1945 in Europe. And the greatest justice we can do is to remember what happened, to study about it, to learn about it, to feel it, to make sure that such a thing should never happen again on the face of this earth to any group, no matter who they are, no matter what they are. And that is the most important thing that we have to do, is we have to make sure that we remember. Canada constructed a Holocaust memorial in Ottawa in 2017.
We now have a place here in our nation's capital where families can come together to learn, to ask those tough questions, to grieve, and to remember. As we remember the millions killed during the Holocaust, we must acknowledge that during that time, the Jewish community had no safe refuge. We must also confront the ugly truth that anti-Semitism is not just a thing of the past in Canada. We need to stand up every day against the cruelty, the hatred, and the indifference that made the Holocaust possible.
So very, very important that we memorialize the Holocaust, remember what happened. There was a wonderful project which was taken up by some high school students back in the early 2000s in Whitewell, Tennessee. They didn't know what 6 million meant. So they started a project where they went ahead and they collected 6 million paper clips. I urge you to see the film.
Our goal
goal was to teach children what happens when prejudice goes unchecked.
We're a community of 1,600 people. We really have no diversity.
The Ku Klux Klan was founded only about 100 miles away.
One of the hardest things for them to comprehend was that Hitler murdered 6 million Jewish people.
A student said, "What is 6 million? I've never seen 6 million."
In the 1940s, people wore paperclips to represent the people who were in the Holocaust at that time.
And we all said, this is the ideal.
It began in a school.
Can we write letters to some people and see if they'll send us some paper clips?
Spread to a town.
The whole community is involved in it.
The attached paperclip is in memory of my grandfather.
25,000 pieces of mail.
Something's going on over here. Across the nation. I'm sending you one paper clip.
We have some from Tom Hanks, Bill Cosby, former President Bush.
And throughout the world.
Paperclips just coming in by the millions.
They're all addressed to Anne.
This is Anne Frank.
I can't get over that.
I don't think it had ever occurred to them that there were people in this world who never knew their grandparents.
I was in Auschwitz for 3 years, and I'm glad I can come and talk to you nice people.
If we have made such a big difference, think what the rest of the world could do if they tried.
I wish the whole world was like you are.
We've asked some very tough questions today, learned some very tough lessons. Hopefully, we will all be committed to justice after the Holocaust and by remembering what happened so many years ago. Thank you very much. I hope you learned and enjoyed. Bye-bye.